Hello and welcome to Lawn and Away, the show where you find out how Boro players did on their lawns last season. And this episode is about Sol Brynn and his time at Swindon Town. And I'm delighted to be joined by Rich from the Loathed Strangers podcast to chat about Sol Brynn's season this year. Rich, how are you doing?
Hello, Jonny. Yeah, it's really nice. I do a fair few of these for my fellow League Two football fans, and it's nice to do one for Middlesbrough because we haven't played for about 25 years. So it's nice to talk about something a little bit different. Yeah, I'm doing very well, thank you, and thank you for asking me to come on.
Yeah, I appreciate you coming on as well, and I'm really excited to talk about Swindon and Sol Brynn for this show because you mentioned there we haven't played in 25 years. You had a bit of an inconsistent season, and also Sol Brynn just seemed to pick up all the accolades. So it'd be really good to kind of find out about that. But he was ever present. He was player of the season, player of the month 3 times, few man of the matches. Overall assessment of Sol Brynn, I'm assuming going to be good.
Yeah, generally, I would say so. You've taken all the good stuff away. The journey of Sol Brynn is quite an interesting one in terms of his Swindon season because
Mm.
he arrived quite early on in the summer. He played in our first friendly against Melksham. And the backstory really goes to the previous season where we had two goalkeepers, two senior pro goalkeepers called Jojo Wallacott, who's now at Charlton, and Lewis Ward. And for the majority of that season, Jojo Wallacott was number one, and rightly so, but he got call-ups to the Ghana national team.
Oh.
And Lewis Ward came in, and although I believe that Jojo Wallacott was by far the superior goalkeeper, Lewis Ward actually did pretty well every time he came in, and every time Jojo came back, Jojo would find himself back into the lineup,
Yeah.
except at the tail end of the season. And the tail end of the season was a good one for Swindon. Lewis Ward was very good at saving penalties, and we got to the playoffs. We got to a penalty shootout in the semi-final. He saved one or two, and we lost. But the general consensus, or a lot of Swindon fans, were very happy with the notion that Lewis Ward would be our number one for 22-23. And then Sol Brynn turns up from Middlesbrough, and the general consensus down here in League Two is that if you get a player on loan, they're not here to sit on the bench. So a fair few fans were a bit vocal about the fact that it's unfair on Lewis Ward, that Sol Brynn comes in, and the head coach at the time, Scott Lindsay, was saying, no, I'm going to give them both a fair crack of the whip. You know, if Sol Brynn doesn't play well, then Lewis Ward comes in. And it was quite apparent very, very early on that wasn't going to be the case, that Sol Brynn was going to be our number one. And Lewis Ward eventually left quite swiftly, in that transfer window. He didn't see out the September deadline. He went to Sutton. On the bait, and although the reasons have never really been disclosed, a lot of the noises from both the Swindon and the Sutton side is that he wanted a fair chance to compete. He didn't feel at Swindon that he would be able to compete with Sol Brynn, probably because of the stipulations of the loan with Middlesbrough. And the reason why that's quite interesting is because Sol Brynn, without really doing anything wrong, was instantly sort of like, he had an element of the Swindon Town fan base that weren't fans of his. And he was involved in quite a considerable error in a friendly against Cardiff, where it wasn't Sol Brynn's fault. It was a poor back pass in our only home friendly against Cardiff. And, people were like, we're going to play this clown instead of Lewis Ward. Now, Lewis Ward wasn't perfect. I wasn't a huge fan of his anyway. And it sort of got to the height on the first home game of the season, which is our second game against Salford, where Sol Brynn's name was actually booed when the lineup was announced. And on the same day, and it might be pure coincidence, the goalkeeper coach, Steve Mildenhall, his car was keyed in the town car park. Now, it might have had nothing to do with Sol Brynn getting the number one shirt, but seems a mighty coincidence, doesn't it? So it started quite poorly in terms of like PR for Sol Brynn. But this first half of the season was really, really good. He's a solid goalkeeper. Like you said, he was winning the Town Player of the Month. I think he won it on 3 occasions before the year was out. He was getting in the teams of the week, both at League Two, and he got one at the Football League generally. And he was a very, very solid goalkeeper, and he didn't have any catastrophic errors throughout that time. The reality is also that Swindon didn't attempt to replace Lewis Ward with a competitive number 2. So they brought in a young lad from Ireland who got injured swiftly after that, and after that, youth goalkeepers were on the bench. So Sol Brynn spent the whole of the season knowing that he wasn't going to get dropped, and I think it's safe to say that that might be why his season didn't stay as consistent as it was in the first half, because you need that competition, I think. Um, but there were never any calls for him to be dropped. Maybe that's because there was no competition.
Yeah.
But he didn't do anything largely wrong. If we talk about his game, his one major flaw really was he didn't like coming off his line too often. Good shot stopper. Kicking is standard for this level at that age. You know, some good, some bad. But the only thing that really stood out to me, listening around me at games, was that he never came off his line, or he didn't seem to. But yeah, he had a good season, and it's one of those seasons, one of those loan deals where the real winner is Middlesbrough and Sol Brynn, because Swindon had a very poor season, a very standard season, but he was one of the reasons why we didn't finish lower in the table. And also Middlesbrough have a 21, 22-year-old who's ready for either the next step in his loan move or to sit on the bench or compete at Riverside.
Yeah, I'll come to Sol Brynn's characteristics in just a minute, but in terms of Swindon's season, playoffs last year, this year you've had a bit of a drop off. Why do you think that was?
Yeah, it's a good question. The season was a disaster, for Town, and that might sound a bit hyperbolic because we didn't go down. We never looked like going down, but it was one of our worst seasons in our history in terms of being in the bottom tier and our points. I think on points haul, it was our second worst season in our history, being in the bottom tier and being where we were. And we only finished a few points above that, what we call the Beamish line, because that was the manager who achieved that unfortunate stat in the 80s. It was inconsistent. We had a great, exciting squad in 21-22, and over the last year we've seen it just pulled apart and sold off and not replaced adequately. We've changed head coaches a couple of times since Ben Garner left for Charlton too. It's not Swindon's fault. Maybe a little bit of ambition, refusing Charlton's advances. It's very hard to do that. I would guess we didn't replace him adequately. We gave the job to his assistant head coach who wasn't experienced. People will say, well, he did well to keep Crawley up because he left us for Crawley Town after Crawley approached Swindon. But, it was Hartlepool and Rochdale were really quite abysmal too. And they really did stay up at the virtue of having two teams worse than them. They only finished 3 points above the line, but that was enough. So fair play to him. And it was under Scott Lindsay where we played where we had our best results. I wouldn't necessarily say our best football. And a lot of fans will say, like, if Scott Lindsay stayed, we might have had a playoff push. I don't believe that to be true. I do think that we flattered to deceive. Our place in the table didn't really represent how we were playing, and we just couldn't string positive results together across the season. And we were bringing in the wrong players. And then Charlie Austin came in late December, early January. Brilliant, fantastic. But when you haven't got a squad around him that can think on his wavelength, it's kind of a pointless endeavor. And he was being played out of his favored position as well. So it was a great shame. And it was really nice for the season to end because it was quite laboured as far as we were concerned. And it's one of those ones where it doesn't take rocket science to figure out what went wrong. We didn't build on the successes of the previous season. We lost players. We changed our philosophy. We changed our transfer policy, and it pretty much all went wrong. So yeah, a great season. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I mean, just ups and downs, nothing really happening, and then just teetered out. I mean, quite a sad way to end it, right? But I mean, in the summer, I'm assuming it's going to be quite a big summer for you guys anyway. You're looking to probably replace Bryn if he was to come back, and I'll
Mm.
probably ask you that a little bit later on. But do you think you need quite a few signings in the summer to try and get yourself back to where you should be?
We don't need as many bodies as we usually
Yeah.
do. The big positive of this summer is we've actually got about 15 players, senior players contracted, which is very rare
Well,
for us. Normally we're new squad in, new squad out, new squad in, new squad out. So we do have players in place, and we've got a new manager now in Michael Flynn, who has a lot of experience in League Two. So we'll
mm,
take that. So he might bring in your standard sort of League One, League Two players. I've got no real major expectations. I don't expect my socks to be blown off anytime soon in terms of what we bring in on a permanent basis. But what he brings in might complement what we've already got, and therefore we might do a little bit better. We might not. We might just stay mid-table mediocrity. It depends on what Flynn does within the changing room, really, because we've seen teams in League Two go up who haven't got budgets because the manager gets them working on the save wavelength and so forth. And sadly for us, League Two is more competitive this year because
mm,
of Wrexham coming in, Notts County coming in, and then coming down, we've got MK Dons and Forest Green Rovers who can function well. And then you've got Mansfield, Bradford,
yeah.
Stockport, all with big budgets. Doncaster look like they're building a semi-decent squad too. So we need to do very, very well in the
Mm,
transfer market, and Flynn needs to get them cooking on gas
yeah.
from the off.
Yeah, it looks a pretty stacked division from what you mentioned there. I hadn't really looked at the division until you said that. So I was like, wow, that is going to be a tough league. But with new managers as well, there comes new styles. They want certain
Mhm.
things. If you haven't seen much of Middlesbrough this season, I probably don't blame you either. We're playing out from the back a lot more. We rely on a sweeper keeper. And we want to play from a lot of distribution. Our distribution is really key from the back. It really dictates on how Boro play through the thirds and create chances. So you were saying earlier around Sol Brynn, doesn't really like to come off his line much. Do you think that potentially might be an issue for Boro then if he was to come back and maybe try and compete for that number one jersey?
I think when the season ended, I just sort of assumed that Sol Brynn would now go to a League One club on
Mm,
loan, and that would make or break him. But
yeah.
then reading a lot of the stuff within the Middlesbrough football fan community and journalists, it suggests that Sol Brynn might get the opportunity to go back up and compete, which I
Mm,
don't think is a bad thing at all. I think he would be a solid number two goalkeeper. I don't think he's number one. Don't think he's ready yet. Play him in maybe a League Cup game. You have probably a reserve team, which we don't have. So he'll be clocking up minutes there. We do play from the back,
mm,
over the last season, and it's something that we've done at Swindon quite a bit. So he's very comfortable on the ball,
mm,
and moving it, and it's more like coming off your line in attacking situations, like corners and when the box is stacked, that it always sort of like, if you just come off your line a little bit, um, to collect the ball, is where he seemed to be a bit more flawed. But I'd be
mm.
really interested to see. I kind of expect if he's going to stay at Middlesbrough, it'll be as number two.
Yeah.
He's not like 18, so
Mm,
it depends. He signed a new contract with Middlesbrough,
yeah.
so again, that makes me think also that maybe one more loan deal might be good for him. He might stay with you for the first half of the season and then spend the second half elsewhere. But I don't see him as a championship number one just yet. No.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask, like, where do you think he can potentially go in his career? Because he has signed a new deal to 2026. Because there was a few Premier League clubs sniffing around, saying, "Oh, we might potentially bring him in and do a similar thing where they'll send him out on loan for a couple of years and eventually integrate him into the first team." But now that you've seen him for a season, probably rose tinted glasses, maybe, and it's prediction time. But how far do you think that Sol Brynn could potentially go in his career?
If he's coached well and if he gets the right loan move, he'll go far. He'll be a solid championship goalkeeper without a
Mm,
doubt. And when you're in the championship, there's every chance you end up in the Premier League. One of our best
mm,
goalkeepers of this side of the century, Wes Froderingham, He
Yeah.
looked the real deal as soon as he stepped in at Swindon, but he's only just going to start playing Premiership games in his 30s now, and this is over 10 years later. Of course, he went to Rangers. Lawrence Vigouroux, who was his replacement, he had a bit of an attitude in his younger years, and he's rebuilding his career at Leyton Orient. It sounds like he's going to Burnley. He'll be on the bench, third choice goalkeeper, but it's not a surprise to me that he's going to find his way there. If teams are looking at Sol Brynn right now, it's because of the homegrown rule.
Yeah.
It's that in the Premier League, much like Lawrence Vigouroux, they're not there because they're outstanding. It's because they are an English goalkeeper, British goalkeeper that gives them an option via the rules. So I think Championship, we had a goalkeeper from Swansea a few years ago, Stevie Bender, who has played in the Championship. He's done okay, but not managed to maintain the number one shirt for various reasons. And I think he's a little bit below Stephen Bender, but not a million miles off. And I would have loved to have seen Sol Brynn in a good team, in a good Swindon team. That would have been interesting. But there's nothing to stop me from thinking that he could become a good top two tier player. It just one bad loan move to the wrong team, and it makes a lot of the difference. So that's always something to consider for Michael Carrick.
Absolutely. And the final question we ask everyone on these shows is, would you take them back or would you let them go? Sol Brynn, if you had the chance next season that it came available, would you take Sol Brynn back?
Swindon Town fans are obsessed with bringing former players back. Every time the transfer window opens, everyone's got an eye on ex-Swindon players, and we just want to have a reunion every year. Like, bring him back, bring him back, bring him back. 5-10 years later, if they said Sol Brynn is coming back on a season long, I don't think any Swindon fan, including myself, will have any issue with that whatsoever. Purely because he is reliable. He's got a lovely head of hair. and he has the opportunity to really get player of the year, because he got player of the year this season gone, but there's a big asterisk to it. Did I say that right? Is it asterisk? I get it wrong. That's the character from the book. Because the club forgot to nominate the person that won all the other Player of the Year awards officially, which was Fraser Blake Tracy.
Really?
So when they did the 5 options for the club 5 options for Player of the Year, they forgot to include the person that won the Supporters Player of the Year, the Swindon Advertiser Player of the Year, and so Sol Brynn won it. He deserved accolades. He did really well, but he wouldn't have won the award had Fraser Blake Tracy. He wasn't my man at Player of the Season, Fraser Blake Tracy, but he won everything else. Which is quite funny. So he could come back and get it for real this time.
I did not know that. That is so funny. Like, I mean, you can't celebrate that, surely. You can't. Like,
Fraser Blake Tracy was quite good about it when the nominations were done. They could have just amended it, They could have just gone, oh, sorry about that. But obviously they gave 5. They would have had to taken someone out probably, but that kind of encapsulates Swindon over the last year, that we forgot to include the person that's winning unless they wanted Sol Brynn to win the Player of the Year, because take Fraser Blake Tracy out and he probably would have won.
Yeah, I was saying, would it be yours then? Is he your Player of the Year, or would you still give it to Blake Tracy?
Like I said, I didn't. My podcast did our equivalent. At the end of the season, when you just need content, right? And we gave it to Romeo Hutton, because although defensively he wasn't the greatest, pretty much all of our creative aspects went through him. Most of the assists went through him, and Charlie Austin wouldn't have scored many of his goals if it wasn't for him. So we gave it to Romeo Hutton. But Sol Brynn would have been in the conversation, and he did. Some of the contributors to the podcast did nominate Sol Brynn. Yeah,
brilliant. So, Rich, if people wanted to learn a little bit more about Swindon Town, where can they find the Loathed Strangers podcast?
Oh, we're everywhere, just like everyone else. All the usual places: Apple, Spotify, SoundCloud, all of them under Loathed Strangers. And although there are plenty of ex-player interviews historically, trying to think of any Middlesbrough links. We don't have that many,
Not
do we?
many. No.
No, Curtis Fleming was a youth player with
Yeah.
us, I think, briefly. I think that's about it for us. Oh, Jan Fjortoft, of course. You
Yeah.
stole
Yeah.
Jan from us. He's been on the pod.
Mm.
Lovely chap. But yeah, you can find the Loathed Strangers in all the usual podcast places.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you very much, Rich. And as always, guys, if you like this type of show and podcast, always give us a 5-star rating on your podcast provider and subscribe to our channel on YouTube. And if you like it as well, leave a comment in the comments below. But for right now, this has been Low and Away. We've been chatting Sol Brynn, and that was our Boro Match Day chatter in a pod. Up the Boro breakdown.